All right. Well, good evening, everybody. Again, like I said before the recording started, super happy to have you all here this evening. We're talking about a fun topic tonight. We're going to dig into free will and determinism. This is a big subject. And once we get towards the end, we'll take it into a little bit more of a practical application. But just as a teaser for the end, know that this is a question that the church and that Christians have been wrestling with for hundreds and hundreds of years, and it's responsible for one of the major splits in the Protestant church specifically. There's a big split, and depending on which track you're on, has a lot to say about what you think about this topic. So it'll be really important, I think, and I think it'll be really good for us to talk about it and to get into it. So we will do that. Before I pray for us, does anybody have like preliminary questions or questions from last week that were lingering that you're like, oh, I just wanted to, throw this out there? If there's nothing explicit, then we'll go ahead. We'll spend just a moment in prayer together, and then we will get started. Lord Jesus, we offer you this time tonight. Lord, I want to take just a moment for us to center ourselves, for us to give our minds and our spirits completely over to what you have to teach us tonight. May you shape us and form us. May this be instructive for our own spiritual walks and our own spiritual journeys. And Lord, I pray that as we dive deep into some of the more meticulous details, and then as we take it and we apply it to our own lives, may this be something that is used to work for building your kingdom here on earth. So Lord, we give you this time tonight. We love you. We ask that you use it, and it's in your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right. So free will is a fun word that gets thrown around a lot. I wanted to read one quote like I like to do. This is from John Bishop in a book he wrote called Natural Agency. And he said, the problem of natural agency or something acting is an ontological problem. It's a problem about whether the existence of actions can be admitted within a natural scientific ontology. Naturalism does not essentially employ the concept of a causal relation whose first member is in the category of person or agent. All natural causal relations have first members in the category of event or state of affairs. And if you heard all that and you're like, I have no idea what any of that means, just know that we're gonna dive into that. We're gonna break all that apart, and you'll sort of get what he's saying. But to summarize a little bit, John Bishop is basically saying that for us to talk about things having agency, for us to talk about things having will or the ability to act, even, it's really a question of how these things exist. Do they exist as beings that are composed of a substance that we call a soul? Are they completely made of material? How do these things all interact with each other? Do events simply cause other events to happen? Or are there beings that have some kind of like causal power that are able to bring things about and able to make things happen? So these are some of the big questions that we're going to be looking at tonight. And again, if you don't understand technology, we're going to get into it. I've tried really hard. I learned from last week a little bit. I've tried to pare down my terminology significantly because last week there was a lot of terminology being thrown around, and like if you missed one piece of terminology and the rest of it just didn't work very well. So I'm going to try and make sure that everything is really well defined this evening. Hey, Greg. I'm going to try and make sure everything is really well defined this evening, so that way you have good touch points where you'll be able to get a good firm grasp of what we're talking about. So as we begin our slow wade into this topic of free will, I want us to first start by thinking about morality and first start by thinking about ethics. Now, we're going to talk about like why we think we should be moral or where morality comes from. We're going to talk about that in a couple of weeks. But regardless as to where we think morality comes from, pretty much all people take some kind of ethical perspective about what they think is right and what they think is wrong. we talk about things, actions that are worthy of praise or that are worthy of blame, and generally, and again, I would say most ethical perspectives depict human beings as intellectually and morally responsible creatures. But carrying this responsibility for your own actions, it seems to require some sort of freedom of the will as a necessary condition, right? Like if you don't have freedom of the will, if you could only do this one specific action, then is it right for us to say that we can punish you if you couldn't have done anything otherwise, right? It seems like as we're thinking about free will, and as we're thinking about even what are we talking about when we talk about free will, I think that this area specifically, it really highlights one of the big areas that free will talks about and that free will touches on. And so the existence of free will, it's really a matter of practical importance for how we think about like using our own ethical and moral perspectives in individual and social dealings with others. But it also becomes this big, troublesome, theoretical matter in light of different worldviews that people choose to embrace. So, for example, if some people, or if you're a naturalist, and if you say that naturalism is true, it's hard to see how human action, like a human actually doing something, could exist, because naturalism seems to depict humans as like these machines of particles that are just like bumping into each other, and everything, all matter is made of just particles that are bumping into each other. And so it seems hard to say like, yeah, humans act in a certain way if you believe that all humans are just matter. It's hard to say that humans act when all things are just particles that are bumping into each other in specific ways. So it's hard to say that, on that kind of view, that human action is something that we can take light of. For Christian theism, certain doctrines have raised problems for certain views about the existence of the nature of free will. So for example, when we think about free will and Christian doctrines, we talk about the existence and the origin of evil, right? And we'll get into that a little bit later today. We talk about the sovereignty of God, or predestination, right? What God foreknew, he also ordained, and what he ordained, he also predestined. So predestination and election is a huge thing that comes in with free will. Or the justice of hell, right? Is there some kind of punishment that is awaiting people at the end of time? And is that something justifiable, depending on if people have free action or not? Or another big one is God's foreknowledge. Can God really know the future? And if God does know the future, how can our actions be completely free and not bound by what God already knows? So it's these big questions when we start thinking about free will that really push us to start thinking about this in, I think, really important ways that is important as we think about having a good foundation for a Christian worldview. So before we get into all of this mess, the isms over there, let's first ask ourselves, what do we mean by freedom? Right? Because this is a word that gets thrown around a lot, and if we misunderstand what we're talking about by freedom, then we are apt to miss the whole conversation. There's really three different understandings of freedom. The first, and this is probably what comes to mind initially just based on the context of where we live. But the first kind of freedom is what's called freedom of permission. And this is generally a social/political idea. Freedom of permission is generally about rights. It's about the authority of the state. It's about the law. And so the specific, it's the specific kind of freedom that when we talk about free. This is not going to be something that we are going to talk about in this class, at all. Not this week, and probably we won't touch on it, but just know that there is this aspect of freedom when people say freedom, that it's a social and political notion. There's also what's called freedom of personal integrity, and it's this basically acting in a unified and responsible way. It it gets a little bit fuzzy, and I don't want to get too deep into it, but just know that this is a developmental term. It's a very psychological term. It's also something that's used inside of spiritual formation, right? Like you are free from something, and so like if you were an addict, you have freedom from those things as you develop. So it's a freedom of personal integrity, and it has a philosophical component to it, but again, is not super philosophically oriented. And so we won't look exactly at that, but it will have ramifications based on what we talk about today. The big one, what we're going to talk about today, is the third thing that we generally mean by freedom, which is freedom of moral and rational responsibility. And this is the question of human action and agency. What does it mean for a human to do something, and who or what is the thing that causes the human to do that thing? And so that's what we're going to be looking at today. One really important thing at the outset before we start getting into heavy definitions is that all Christians agree that we have free will. Look at us Christians, we managed to agree on something. We all agree that we have free will. However, there are major differences concerning what free will is. And so as we get, again, deeper into this, and as we start thinking about this from a Christian perspective, just know that all Christians, I probably shouldn't say all, probably 98% of Christians agree that we have free will of some kind, and that there are major differences concerning what that free will is. Are there any questions before we dive into definition land?
I understood that freedom was a sentient being having the ability to self-determine a choice.
So that's what we're going to be asking ourselves is that what freedom is? Basically, the type of freedom that we're talking about is this kind of moral and rational responsibility.
But that would be a response to a choice.
Which one?
What you just said. If you've got a moral background, then that's a choice.
Well, it's a category of things. So we're basically asking the question: do humans have the capability to act in moral and responsible ways? Do they have the freedom of the will? And if they do, how do we understand it?
Are they free moral agents?
Right. That's what we're going to be asking. So let's get into some definitions. Because when we think about free will, there are three main camps that people fall into. And these words are going to be ones I throw around fairly frequently, and so these definitions are going to be pretty important. The first word that we're going to look at is the word determinism. And it's a big word, but determinism is basically the view that for every event that happens, so event is, you can think of big event, you can think of action, you can also think of event as a mental event. So for every thought, for every emotion, for every reaction, also those classify as an event. But for every event that happens, there are conditions such that given them, nothing else could have happened. So determinism says that for any given event, we'll call it E, that for any given event, there are steps, A plus B plus C. There are steps, there are conditions, there are other events that happen that cause this event to be the case, and that apart from these conditions, E doesn't exist. So determinism says that given all three, well, in this case it's three, but given all of these different conditions, however many there happen to be, E, the event, will always be the outcome, right? So a good way to remember this is a determinist believes that your actions are determined by things outside, and that those outside things influence and cause your brain to behave in certain ways, and the way that your brain behaves in certain ways then causes other things to happen. So that's what determinism is. Your factors, or your mental facilities, your capabilities, all events are determined by something else. Now, on the flip side of that, you have, I'm trying to make sure that I find it in here correctly. Well, on the other side of that, you have libertarianism. And for those who are looking for it, the root word for liberal is also right in there. Liber. It's a Latin word, but that word means free. Generally, it's like free of constraint. It's free of outside influences. And a libertarian believes that given these circumstances A, B, and C, that it could lead to this event, but that these things are not the only determining factor, that there is a bigger and broader category of agency that we call P, which is person, that ultimately brings about an event. We're going to define that one a little bit more carefully as we look into it. But libertarian.
So P would be an environment.
Well, so P is a person.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so P, I'm trying to do it so like E is event. Event, P is person. So it's a person. So basically what libertarianism would say in its probably most precise form. So what libertarianism would say in its most precise form is that P, a person, is some kind of substance, which we talked about last week. A person is most likely a soul kind of substance that has some kind of causal power to bring about the event. So again, mental event, physical event, you can think of it however you want. For any event that happens, the person exerts their power as what we call a first mover. And again, we're going to get into that, but they exert their power as a first mover, an uncaused performer of that action to make the event happen. There wasn't anything that caused them to do it. They just did it. Libertarianism also holds that this person had the ability to refrain from exerting their power to bring about the event. So they had the option to either do E or to do not E. And libertarianism also holds that the person had some reason, whatever that reason may be, that was the end or was the final cause for the sake of which they did the action or event, or that the event took place. Again, we're going to get into that. We're going to break it down a little bit more to help out, but just know that libertarianism specifically it holds to this view that human action really is the result of humans using their own causal powers. Being this thing, this substance that we call a soul that is endowed with these powers, that they are, that human action is the result of them using those powers without anything being different outside of their being. So ultimately, maybe the best way to think of this is, again, the Liber in libertarianism says like humans are free from outside constraints, that the human is the absolute originator of their actions. So all actions come solely and directly back to the human person is the best way to think of that. And so, as you might be able to tell, determinism and libertarianism are at odds with each other. If you are a libertarian, then determinism is not for you. You don't think that determinism can happen, that it's, that it has problems as a view. And determinists would say the same thing, that a lot of determinists, not all naturalists are determinists, but a lot of them are, but a determinist would say that, there isn't any such thing as a person being able to just cause an event or cause some kind of choice, like these things were all determined. Again, if you're a naturalist, you would probably say that these things are all determined because we're just matter bumping into itself, and so nobody actually has a free will or a free choice, is what a determinist would say. But then we come to this third view, and this third view is where things start to get interesting. It's called compatibilism. Sometimes it's called soft determinism. But compatibilism says that though libertarianism and determinism seem to be at odds with each other, that in fact, if you take both of these stances, not in like a hard, strict sense, but if you take them both in a softer sense, that human actions can actually be necessitated by the events that caused it. But if we understand human actions correctly, then those can also be considered as free actions. And so compatibilism would say that A plus B plus C equals E as a free action. Basically, the best way to think of compatibilism is to say determinism and libertarianism are compatible with each other. They're two ideas that you can mesh together and that you can make one idea. There's a bunch of different ways to think about that, but again, compatibilism is generally the view that human action is causally necessitated by the events that preceded it. So the events that came before whatever event we're talking about had to have happened. That human actions are ultimately part of like a causal chain of events that lead up to them. And so one of our main purposes today, and again, we'll dive back into these definitions here in just a second, but one of our main purposes for today is actually to compare compatibilism and libertarianism. And by the time that this class is over, you're going to get sick and tired of hearing me say those words. But our purpose is it's to define and compare them, because part of being able to evaluate the different views is understanding what they are and understanding what makes them up. And so we're going to look specifically at these two. It's really important that you know what determinism is. We're not going to qualify that as a viable option today, because it basically is the view that we have no free will. The answer is just no. There is no such thing as free will.
So as a Calvinist, a determinist?
So a Calvinist would be a compatibilist.
Why?
Because a Calvinist would still say that we have free will, but it's not free will in the libertarian sense. And so that's what we're going to get into today. And at the very, very end, that's sort of the big area that we're going to talk about, because when you read Calvinist thinkers, people like Jonathan Edwards or like George Whitefield might not have been a Calvinist, but Jonathan Edwards especially, he was. Yeah. So Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, these great Calvinists who came, they taught that God is sovereign, that God has control over all things, including people's actions, but people are still free. And so people would say, how can you possibly do that? And so a compatibilist is somebody who says, this is how things are, and here's how it's the case. And so we'll look at that, and then we'll evaluate the views at the very end. For those who are like being held in suspense or like, I don't know, that's really uncomfy. I am a libertarian. I don't hold to compatibilism. I certainly don't hold to determinism. Libertarianism definitely makes the most sense to me, especially when we think about morality and when we think about judgment and punishing. And if libertarianism is not the way that the world works, then I would say that we've all done something really wrong, but we were all determined to do that anyway, so it doesn't matter. But our main purpose for today is to understand what these two different views say, like what some of their strengths and weaknesses are, to compare them a little bit, and really to try and get an understanding of what we mean when we say free will. So let's think about compatibilism for a second. This idea that somehow humans having this like causal action that they can do, but yet it's still determined, these two things being together. Is there some good way that we can define it? And again, I read this definition already, but compatibilism is basically the view that says that human action is causally necessitated. It's something that is necessarily caused. It can't be any other way by the events that come before it. And this is all events that come before it. So human actions ultimately become part of this causal chain of events that lead up to it. A good way to think about this for a compatibilist is to think of 10 dominoes, right? And so the compatibilist would say that for any event that happens here, we'll say the event is the domino falling over. For this domino to fall over, the compatibilist would say that beginning with knocking over this first domino with all of these events set in motion, even before this person was born, that all of these events necessitate falling into each other, falling, until you reach this event here. And so this event necessarily happens by all the events that preceded it, by all the ones that came before it, right? Now, there are two kind of ways of understanding this that compatibilists have put out, and we're going to use, I'll put him right here above my head. Our good friend Jones is going to come back. He's happy. He loves to be in philosophy class. But let's think about these two different definitions. So there's a classical definition that basically says, if you're a compatibilist, that a person is free a person can be said to have free will if and only if this person is able to act according to their desires and preferences in the absence of external constraint, right? So a really simple example of this, Jones, my friend here, Jones is free to leave the room if he desires, and if like no one is holding him down or keeping the door locked, even if his desire to leave is, somehow causally determined by all of the events that came before it, a compatibilist would say on a classic definition that Jones is free if Jones can leave the room in accordance with his own desires, and there's no external thing that's hindering that. Now, there was another group of compatibilists, I'm getting my C's mixed up. There's another group of compatibilists that came along later and said, yeah, that seems to be an okay definition, but it doesn't seem to totally get at the heart of what free will is. Because it seems like in this way, your choices are, somehow determined, but the agent doesn't seem to have any control of your action or your desire that causes them. And so the classical freedom of action, like if the only way that we understand freedom is that it's freedom of action, it's not really sufficient for talking about freedom or for talking about real freedom. And so they, what are called contemporary compatibilists, they came up with this thought experiment. And they said, okay, let's imagine that our friend Jones has had an electrode, like a big radio signal, placed in his brain by some scientist. And this electrode allows the scientist to know what is going on inside of Jones's brain. He knows on any single occasion what Jones is going to do. And the electrode also allows the scientist to cause Jones to do whatever he wants. So now, let's suppose that this scientist wants Jones to kill Jones's friend Smith, right? Scientist has something against Smith. I don't know.
Sounds like a Manchurian thing.
Probably, yeah. But suppose that Jones wants, or the scientist wants Jones to kill Smith, and Jones himself, external, like completely separate from the influence of the scientist, is already beginning to think about killing Smith. He has something against him too. I don't know, maybe Smith stole money from him or something. But so we run into sort of a conundrum here, because if Jones decides not to kill Smith, then the scientist will activate the electrode in his brain and cause the killing. But the scientist can also read on his little readout that he doesn't necessarily need to, because Jones will carry out the action on his own. And so this raises a question of, is Jones free in one case or in not another case? Or is Jones free in both cases because his action matches up with his initial desire to do the killing that was external of anything that the scientist did? So in which case is Jones free? These compatibilists would say. And so what this example does is it shows that freedom of the will, or like the actual determination or desire to do something, seems to be more central to what we call the freedom of the will than just simply the freedom of bodily action, right? So there's something beyond bodily action. There's something deeper than just bodily action that is more central to a person being free than just having free will, right? So that's our compatibilist example. So just remember Jones here, because we're going to flip back and forth a little bit. So remember Jones with the electrode in his head, because he's going to come back. But now let's think about libertarianism. Is there a good way we might be able to understand, or like a good analogy that we can use to understand libertarianism? Well, not so resident anymore, but resident smart guy Aristotle wrote in his book on physics. He said that a staff moves a stone, and a stone is moved by hand, and the hand is moved by a person. And so for Aristotle, the stone being moved by a staff, the staff being moved by, I'm not actually going to draw a hand, it's just going to be a little dot. The staff being moved by hand, the hand being moved by a person. So for Aristotle, what he would say is, if we understand actions to take place in this case, the action or the event here is the stone actually moving, that we can trace the actions all the way back to some first uncaused mover, some first mover who caused the action to be, that there are no other events that necessarily led up to that one, that there's some kind of first cause, or again, an uncaused mover. Not, I don't even say it wouldn't necessarily be a need.
But I'm just saying, as an example, a need would be a first cause.
A need wouldn't necessarily be a
If the
first
stone's
cause.
sitting on his wife, and he wants to get the stone off, that's the need.
Right, but even if there's no wife there, let's say the guy just wanted to move the stone, or a Buddhist monk wants to go and wants to rake, they do the raking outside with their rakes. Now there's a reason behind it. He probably has some kind of reason for moving the stone. People don't generally just arbitrarily decide to say, oh, I'm gonna go push a stone with stick. But if they do, and they are arbitrarily like just throwing their hands up and be like, I'm just gonna go throw it, then the reason is they wanted to arbitrarily go and exercise free will. We start getting into this a little bit, the rationality condition, when we start thinking about, is there a reason that happened? But suffice it to say, for right now, thinking about libertarianism, that understanding it is more in this way, that there's some kind of first cause, there's some kind of unmoved mover. There's a thing that didn't have anything come before it that causes the event to take place. Whereas in the case of Jones and in the case of the electrode, Jones was always going to kill Smith, because it was determined that he would do so, whether it be the electrode in his brain or whether it be the events that led up to that, a compatibilist would say. And so those are sort of two ways of understanding what's going on inside of that, is the will being something that's determined by outside in forces for the compatibilist, and the libertarian saying that people are uncaused first movers. Is that making sense so far? Do people have questions or anything I can help clarify before we get into before we get a little bit deeper into it? Okay. So as we think about these two views, compatibilism and libertarianism, there's really five. What do I call them? There's 5 areas, right? There's 5 key pieces needed that are central to an adequate theory of free will. So if we're going to say that, compatibilism or libertarianism or determinism, or if you can come up with some other kind of ism, let me know, and we'll go get a PhD in philosophy together, and it would be amazing. But there are really 5 areas that are central to this adequate theory of free will, and it needs to be able to address all 5 of these areas in a way, again, that helps make sense of some of these situations that we find, as we've talked about with metaphysics before. And what you'll notice is we're going to start here at the top, and each one is going to bleed into the other one until eventually, when we get down here, I was going through this earlier today, and I got to the bottom, and I'm like, you don't really need this. This one maybe not. These first 3 are pretty crucial, but once you get down to these last 2, you're like, yeah, we've heard all of this before. Like, we get it, but it's still a necessary and important piece of the theory. So we're going to talk about each one of these different conditions. We'll say a brief note about what it means, and then we'll compare compatibilism and libertarianism and say, okay, how do we understand this? Or is there something inside of here that maybe makes us lean one way or the other way? And so the first area to consider when thinking about free will, when trying to come up with a good theory of free will, is something that's called the ability condition. And the ability condition is simply this: if you are going to be a free creature, if you are going to be said to have free will, then the ability condition says that in order to have the freedom necessary for responsible agency, one must have the ability to choose or act differently from the way that the agent does. So basically, in order for me to be considered free and there to be an action in front of me, I either have to be able to not do the action in front of me, or it has to be explained why I have to do the action in front of me. It's the ability condition. Or to put it differently, it's the question, can I act differently than I do? Do I have the ability to act differently than I would? And so the 2 different views, quite naturally view this very differently. Compatibilism views this ability condition as what I'm going to call a hypothetical and one-way ability. And basically, this just means that compatibilism, again, think of the following dominoes. Compatibilism says that really events happen in a very specific way because of the events that lead up to them, and the event could happen differently if the events that preceded it were different. That makes sense, right? This domino would fall if I touched all of these, but if I touched a different domino, say I have another set over here. If I touch this one, then E doesn't happen, right? So they're able to say, like, yeah, different things can happen under a different set of circumstances. A compatibilist would also say, I'm sorry, I'm looking at my notes, that we are free to will whatever we desire, though what a compatibilist will be quick to say is those desires themselves are determined by the things that happen outside of us. But that freedom ultimately is a willingness and an ability to act on our strongest preference. So a good way to think about this is if Jones is given a choice to do action A or action B, Jones will freely will to do action A because a compatibilist would says he most desired to do A. And so if Jones here has an option between A and B, and Jones has some desire, that's my little exclamation mark representing Jones' desire. If Jones has a desire to do A more than he does to do B, then what the compatibilist would say is there were a series of events that led up to Jones's desire, and Jones's desire to do A is stronger than his desire to do B, and so naturally, if he's free, he would be able to follow his desire and do A. And so Jones's ability, it's a hypothetical situation, right? Because hypothetically, there could have been a different set of events that led Jones to think about things slightly differently that might have led him to B. But hypothetically, he didn't do that. So because things are the way that they are, because it's not the hypothetical situation, Jones, in fact, freely did action A. But a libertarian says, this seems to be just extremely wrong-headed in the first place, right? Because a libertarian would say that this whole way of even thinking about desires and determined desires is itself mistaken. And so a libertarian would ask, are we free to even want in the first place? Do we have the ability to determine or to choose what it is that we want in the first place? And so libertarian would then ask the question, okay, so you have the option of A, but is there also the option of not A? I believe that's a symbol for not. Yeah. So is Jones free to do option A? Is Jones free to also resist and do not A? Or, given the exact same set of circumstances, is Jones also free to do B? Exact same set of circumstances. And so the libertarian would say that instead of just this hypothetical sort of one-way ability, a libertarian would say we have a categorical two-way ability. And this categorical act means that if Jones freely does or wants to do A, let's say for the sake of argument that Jones does freely do action A, Jones raises his hand, right? That Jones also had the ability to not raise his hand under this categorical definition. But things being exactly the same as they were, no internal difference, no events leading up to things differently, a libertarian would say Jones also had the freedom to do B. Jones had the ability to stand up and walk out of the room. He didn't have to fit with option A or not option A. And so libertarians call this a two-way ability or a dual ability, which again says if a person has the ability to exert their power to do a certain action, they also have the ability to refrain from doing that action. And so you start to see the contrast a little bit, right? Where under compatibilism, it's a one-way action that leads to a certain event, and libertarianism it throws it a little bit more open. It says we have the ability to do A, we also have the ability to do not A, but we also have the ability to do B, and it's all of these different actions that come into place. And so That's how both sides answer the ability condition. Now, a quick word of what's the word I'm looking for? Oh my gosh. Comparison. It is an ism. A quick word of comparisоnism. But a quick word of comparison between ability condition. It can be hard, I think, to understand the compatibilist view because it doesn't totally match up with our own sense experience of the world around us, right? When I'm faced with a decision, I very truly and honestly feel like I have the decision to do either A or not A, or to do something that says B. And I think that sense experience tells us something important about our own freedom of the will. So if you're thinking about this ability condition, you're saying, I see maybe what the compatibilist is saying, but I don't necessarily know that I agree with it. Just know you're not alone, that this sort of two-way ability to be able to do all of these different options instead of saying the events cause this thing to happen in this way. It's what makes the most sense. Yeah. Let's go ahead and move to the second condition. Oh, we're doing plenty good on time. So the second condition is what's called the control condition. So ability condition is, can I act differently than I do? But the second question is then, if I can act differently than I do, am I actually in control of my own actions, right? Like, do I have what we would call control over my actions? And so basically, this asks the question, what is the thing that causes my actions to happen, right? If I have the ability to do differently, do I actually do it? Like, do I have the power inside of me to actually do differently is what control is asking. And so there's two different theories of action, and you're starting to get a hint a little bit of where this is going. The libertarian, we're going to start with them this time, but the libertarian would say that, again, the control condition comes right back to the first unmoved mover, right? That there are such things that we like to call instrumental causes. So an instrumental cause is something that is used in a chain that, after being affected by the first cause, it becomes a second cause and then a third cause that ultimately leads to the event happening. And so here, the person's hand is an instrumental cause because it's an instrument. The stick is an instrumental cause because they are acting as causes. The man is pushing the hand is pushing the stick, and the stick is ultimately pushing the stone, and this is the final cause. But for all of these different things that happen, the libertarian would say there are instrumental causes, but ultimately these instrumental causes have to come back to an initial first cause, a starting cause that set them all into being. Maybe a good way to think about this is, imagine a line of 8 cars, right? We'll call them green cars because I like the color green. They're nice green sedan cars. They're sitting in the road, and up behind them comes a red car going too fast and doesn't stop in time and bumps into, we'll call the red car number 1. He bumps into that first green car on the line, and then successively down the line, the cars all bump into each other because they're parked in Nashville and distance between cars is like 2 inches. So what we would say in this case is that the red car is this first cause. It's the one that caused these chain of events to happen. But the individual green cars themselves are what we call instrumental causes. They were instruments that happened in bringing about the event. They were carriers of the movement as it happened, but they themselves did not cause the accident to happen, right? They were just instrumental they were instruments in making that cause happen. Compare this to a compatibilist idea. It's called the causal theory of action. And so let's imagine our set of dominoes again. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So we have our 10 set of dominoes here that are all leading to some event. Let's say the event is Jones raising his hand. Now let's imagine that dominoes 4 through 7 are just a slightly different color, right? Let's say these are black and these are green. Do I have a different color? Oh, this is going to make this so much fun. Sorry. Sorry, I should have thought about this beforehand. Yeah, look at that. All right, so we have 4 dominoes. They're slightly different color, and so a way that a compatibilist would say that we have control is that control is equal to events causing each other. It's equal to the dominoes falling down. Or a compatibilist might say it's the chain of events running through or passing through an agent in the correct way. So let's think about this in terms of Jones raising Jones's hand, right? So Jones is said to be free and is said to act in control of his own actions if an event runs through Jones in the correct way. So for the sake of saying what we're talking about, so Jones here, again, having the electrode placed inside of his head by the scientist, Jones decides that Jones is going to raise his hand. So Jones is free. Jones is able to raise his hand in the events that led up to that point. Let's say Jones is sitting and he's waiting to vote on something. The events leading up to Jones deciding that he is going to vote, Jones raises his hand of his own volition. A compatibilist would say that all of the events led up to that point and they passed through, they ran through Jones in the appropriate and correct way. However, were the situation to be different, so let's again consider the situation with the scientist where at just the time that the vote is about to happen, the scientist sees that Jones is not going to raise his hand, but pushes the button on his magical device and makes Jones raise his hand instead, thus causing Jones's hand to go up. A compatibilist would say, well, this is not a free act because Jones was not in control of his hand going up. And the answer is because his hand going up, though it's a determined event, it's caused by a different chain of events that did not pass through Jones directly, right? So these chain of events that are the vote, right, like getting the vote ready, leading up to the vote, Jones entering in, but now Jones is like, I don't want to do that. The scientist is able to sort of do an end around the person of Jones by saying, okay, now the event is going to pass through me instead of you. And so the event, I'm going to use my different color marker again. So the event now becomes these 4, and it runs through these that leads to the desired outcome. And so the compatibilist would say because Jones is represented by these 4 red dominoes here, because Jones was, the event did not properly run through him or did not adequately run through him, or it didn't go through him in the correct way, or in this case, probably didn't even go through him at all. Jones's action was not free, that there was a chain of events that happened, that these dominoes fell over in a way that did not impact Jones, but the event still happened. And so Jones was not free in that case. But if the scientist hadn't used this and Jones had desired to raise his hand, then the chain of events would have passed through Jones. Again, our 4 red dominoes here. It would have passed through Jones in the correct way, and Jones would have raised his hand to vote. Is that sufficiently confusing? But it's this idea of being in control of one's actions, right? And so again, for the libertarian, this seems like a fairly easy case to handle, where humans have this dual control, right? We have the power to exercise ability, we have the power to restrain ability. Like we have the power to either act or we have the power to not act. But the compatibilist would also say that Jones is only free to raise Jones's hands if the events pass through him in the correct way. And hopefully you're starting to think, and this gets deeper into compatibilism than what we're going to get into today, but you can start thinking by way of, I keep thinking comparisоnism, and I know that's not the right word, but you can start thinking of this in terms of comparison, and start thinking about compatibilism and say, okay, what does it mean for an event to run through an agent? Like, what does it mean for it to pass through them? And what does it mean for it to pass through them in the correct way? Like, those are very vague terms that seem to, they seem to be vague, and the definitions get complex and very detailed. And I could just tell you, if you want to go look into it, you're more than welcome to go look into it. But I don't think that those hold up quite as well trying to understand events passing through someone in the correct way. So we have our first two areas so far. Our ability condition is, can I act differently than I do in control condition? Am I in control of my actions? The third area that's really central to an adequate theory of free will is what's called the rationality condition. And here is sort of what Greg was getting at earlier. It's, do I have a reason for acting? And this is asking the question of, what is it that ultimately drives our actions? Is there something that, makes our actions not necessarily happen? I'm trying to drives or motivate. I don't even know if that's the right word. But it's asking this question: do I have a reason for acting? Now, to understand how these two different theories understand rationality, we have to understand a couple more different kinds of causes. And I know I've been throwing causes at you left and right, but there's sort of two causes that we're going to talk about here. There's what's called efficient causes, and there are what's called final causes. So an efficient cause is basically, it's the thing that directly brings something else into being. Yes, an efficient cause is that by means of which an effect is produced. So one ball moving another one, right? Let's say you're playing pool or billiards, and you hit the cue ball, right? The cue ball hitting the striped 9 ball is an example of the cue ball being the efficient cause of the 9 ball moving. Seems, hopefully that's straightforward. But it's important for us to understand efficient causes for this reason, because a compatibilist, when saying, do I have a reason for acting? How do I understand my own reasons for acting? A compatibilist would say that beliefs and desires, these mental events, these are actually the things that cause actions to happen. That the states within a person that are caused, again, by other different events, but that these states within a person are ultimately what cause the states that a person enters into, or the actions that a person does. It's ultimately what causes them to occur. A good way maybe to help think about this, or to sum it up in a shorter way, is to say that under compatibilism, freedom presupposes rationality. So freedom presupposes. So it's saying that in order for us to be free, we must first be rational, because our reasons that we have for doing something, that ultimately causes our actions. However, on the flip side of that, a libertarian, somebody who holds this kind of libertarian freedom, would say that reasons actually are not the efficient causes. They don't bring events into being, but rather reasons are the final cause. So a final cause is the end of something, and not the end as in like, I'm going to just completely cut something off, or I'm going to destroy it or something like that. But a final cause is the sake for which an effect is produced, right? So if I want to build a table, I will have different efficient causes that go into it, but the final cause is me building a standing structure that has 4 legs on it that we call a table. So the table is the final cause of, let's say, my woodworking activities or events. It's the sake for which an event is produced. It's a goal, it's an end, it's a purpose for which an event is done. The event itself, so let's say E, the event is, it's a means to the end that is the final cause. So I like Greg's analogy, so let's use it. So let's say that in our example here, we'll call this guy Smith because the other guy's Jones. So let's say in our example here, in understanding libertarian rationality, the reason is the final cause. And so let's say that Smith's wife got trapped under a rock, and Smith, being just a studly dude, is able to pick up a stick and is able to just push the rock with the staff. And so the staff ends up being the instrumental cause, and the instrumental cause, it's also an efficient cause in a sense because it's directly causing what's happening. But the final cause is no longer the event anymore. It was in that example. But the final cause now is the wife. So the wife is the reason, she's the rationale. He's like, her getting up out of the rock is now the goal for which the rock is being moved. And so the event of the rock being moved itself starts with Smith moving, using his efficient and instrumental causes to move the rock, with the final cause of freeing his wife from underneath of it.
But wouldn't a compatibilist say, no, that it started with Smith getting buried and valuing that relationship over time, and these things become the dominoes that led to the need of moving the rock?
Yes, so a compatibilist would say that basically this desire, right, or this reason that Smith has for moving the rock it's part of those events that caused Smith to go and to move the rock. You could also say inside of there that Smith's love for his wife is a cause that has been built up over years, right? Because if Smith doesn't love his wife, then maybe he's like, oh good, I can finally let that woman just be crushed and I can get on with my life.
So why would a libertarian move the rock?
So libertarian would move the rock because it is their own uncaused free agency that is choosing to move it. Now this is where you get into one of the big areas of contention between these two, right? Is what role do our desires and thoughts and wills play? Right? So desire, thought. Because a compatibilist would say that your desire is something that is caused by the events that happened before it, and that it will necessarily cause the event to happen. So if the event is moving the rock off, Smith moving the rock off of his wife, they would say that the events that led up to that moment, Smith was necessarily, there was no other way it could have been, he was going to move that rock off of his wife because of the events that preceded it. A libertarian would say that even given all of the different things that went into it, even given Smith's desires, even given his thoughts, that it was not necessarily the case that Smith would move the rock. That Smith still had the ability to say, even though I love my wife, even though I want to save her, that Smith could have chosen to simply just not move the rock. And so this is actually a big critique of libertarianism from compatibilism. Compatibilists say you have your thoughts, you have your desires, you have all these different events that lead up to things, but if people are just able to sort of randomly and haphazardly choose what they do, what role do what role do desires, what role does will actually play in making a choice, right? Because if it doesn't cause the event to happen, if it doesn't make it come into being, then what is the thing that makes it come into being? A libertarian would probably fire back and say, our desires and our thoughts and the events that have happened to us beforehand, these all become things that we think about and that can influence our decision, maybe even influence us in really, really strong ways. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the person as the uncaused cause is the source of the event and not the events that came up to it beforehand. Does that make sense? Because it's a really good question, trying to think about the desires and the things that lead up to it. And this is a huge question if you ever deal with somebody who who's an addict in some way, right? It seems like those people are just absolutely gripped by their addiction, that it seems like they are absolutely unable to choose otherwise because of certain events that have led up to that point. And that it's something common that comes up to that. And so a compatibilist would say, yes, an addict actually is not able to choose otherwise. And so the events that lead up to that are, going to point them in one way or another. But a libertarian would say that even if an addict has been using for 20 years, they've been using the most addictive substances that you can think of, that even still in that moment, they have the ability to choose either to do it or to not do it, or to do something else entirely. And so you have to, it's about weighing those options. And again, it's saying what is, getting back to this a little bit, but it's saying my reasons, the desires, or the will that I have, does that actually cause the thing to happen as being rational somehow before being free? Or a final cause, a libertarian would say, is does rationality, does it presuppose freedom. So basically it says that because we are free creatures to choose, we can actually choose, in certain cases, we can choose what we believe and what we don't believe. And now there are extreme versions of this naturally. It's a fun word. It's called doxastic voluntarism. And it's just an extreme view that says you can actually believe anything that you want to and just automatically believe it. And there's almost nobody that actually thinks that this is the case, right? Nobody would say right now, in their right mind, they would look next to me and say, oh yeah, there's a 10-ton pink elephant standing right next to you. And like honestly believe that. But what a libertarian would probably buy into and would say is that this sort of indirect sense of this is true, right? It's this idea that a person's beliefs can result from a process of thinking about them, which exercises one's freedom at various points along the way using their rationality. And so this whole idea of deliberating or of thinking of the best course of action to take, it automatically presupposes that we have this kind of freedom to decide what is best and what is not best, or to decide what our beliefs are and what our beliefs aren't. To whereas on compatibilism, it says that these sort of choices and these sort of deliberations or these desires and things, they've already been put in place, and your freedom now comes out of those, is what a compatibilist would say. So that's a rational, or that's the rationality condition, is do I have a reason for acting? Now, again, like I said, these last two are really quick, so I'll briefly touch on those, and then we'll get into the so what or why does this matter. But the fourth area that's necessary for an adequate theory of free will is causation, which again we've talked about what kind of things cause other things. I just want to very briefly mention this. We've said it a little bit already, but if you're a compatibilist, then you hold sort of necessarily to this idea that event causation is what has to be the case, and the only kind of things that can actually interact in a causal sense are events, or what are sometimes called states, like a state of matter. It's a way of being. And so the only things that can act in causal relationship to each other are events. And people themselves are actually just a series of events through which a causal chain passes through on its way to an effect. And so on this compatibilist view, a person doesn't, it's consistent to say that they have a soul, but they don't even necessarily have to be a soul, or they don't even necessarily have to be a substance, like we talked a little bit about last week. But a person, in its most strict sense, under compatibilism, is defined as a person, or a person is defined as a series of events through which a causal chain passes through. And so for a compatibilist, the only things that can interact with each other are events. So one thought leads to another, leads to another, leads to an action, leads to a thought, leads to a thought, and they necessarily cause the next thing to happen. But for a libertarian also would agree that event causation is probably the best way to understand normal events in the world, right? Like a brick breaking glass. So brick breaking glass would be the event of, let's say the brick is sitting very precariously on the edge of a wall, and the wind comes and the wind blows the brick, and because the brick is precariously placed, the event of the wind hitting the brick now falls, and so the event of the brick falling now leads to the brick coming into contact with the glass beneath it, and the glass and the brick coming into contact lead to the event of the glass breaking. And so libertarians would say, yeah, there's such thing as an event causation that can account for things in the normal world. But when it comes to, not the normal world, the natural world, we live in the normal world, sorry. But when it comes to the free act of persons, specifically when it comes to the person themselves are a substance. The person themselves are made up of something, which again, as we talked about last week, probably isn't matter. Again, the best way to think of this is as a soul, but the person is a substance, and as this sort of agent, they act as the first term in this causal relation. So these substances that we call people are able to act uncaused by anything else. They're able to act in spite of everything else that is around them, that is inside of them, that is outside of them. They're able to act in whatever way they see fit, because they have these causal powers and they're able to act in a way that brings about some kind of new, causal relation. So it's just a small note of what causes what. Under compatibilism, it's events cause events, and under libertarianism, it's person causes event, as an uncaused cause. And the very last one is person as agent. And again, we already touched on this, but a compatibilist would say that a person is a series of events through which a causal chain passes on its way to producing an effect. And a libertarian would say that a person must be some kind of substance with a causal power, or with causal powers, plural. So those are 5 areas that are central to an adequate theory of free will. Does anybody have questions on these before we ask the so what question? And you probably have a million questions on this, and that's okay. It's good. But are there any questions that you would like addressed right now? All right. Well, let's ask our so what question. And as I hinted at earlier, this discussion of free will, it becomes really important in the Protestant church because you have 2 sort of main thinkers, and really it's 3, and 2 of them kind of get lumped together and one kind of stands on his own. But you have these 2 kind of camps of main thought that emerge in the Protestant church. You have the group that's following John Calvin, which holds very, very strongly to this idea of predestination, holds very, very strongly to the idea of God's sovereignty, that God is in control of everything, like every possible thing that that you can think or that you can do, of every event that happens, that God is in control. That's what it means for God to be sovereign, is that God controls all things.
There's nothing that happens without his will.
Right. There's nothing that happens without the will of God. Now, this is compared to what we call opposite of John Calvin, and coming a couple years after him was a guy named Justus Arminius, I believe. Yeah, but his view got boiled down to more or less that God is still sovereign, that God is still in control, but that God is not the one that's in control of our actions. That ultimately humans are the ones that are responsible, and humans are the ones that are the cause of our own actions. And this got picked up by Wesley a couple hundred years later. And this was, I did a project on this, not this past spring, but the spring before that. This was one of Wesley's big contentions with a lot of his other counterparts. Because what Wesley purported was that if humans don't have free will, if we are somehow determined by the natural world, or if we're somehow determined by God, which is what a compatibilist would say. A compatibilist would probably say that our actions are determined, but we are still free. What Wesley said is, if this is really the case, if we are somehow determined, if God has somehow determined our actions and our steps, then that must make God the author of evil. Right? Because all evil acts that we do, if they're simply just one event bumping into another, and it's just running through us, then the event that set all of those things into being, the very first cause, the very first uncaused cause, which a Christian compatibilist would say is God, but that very first uncaused cause made everything else happen. And therefore, because there's evil in the world, and because the scriptures say that God can't stand evil and that God is going to punish evil, that God also created the evil that he is now so dead set against, and that he is now going to punish, and that God ultimately is the author of evil. And so this becomes this big contention point, and it's a huge split now, and you can actually go to different denominations. This is one of the few theological points that people have put a little bit of effort into in a very, very general sense, because this big dotted line, it became a huge jumping point. And so generally speaking, for your Calvinists, you have like your Baptists, and you have your Presbyterians, sometimes fall in the Calvinist realm, and then your Arminians, you have people like the Methodists and the Nazarenes. but we're basically Methodists.
Where does the Catholic Church fall into this?
Yeah, so this is actually something really interesting because Calvin and Arminius, they wrote after a guy, his name is Thomas Aquinas.
Did he precede these two? He did.
Yeah, Aquinas wrote in I want to say it was 10, so like the 1000 era. And these guys were writing like
12 to 13.
Yeah, I think Wesley was later. Wesley was
Yeah,
more like
Wesley was
16. Yeah, 16 or 17. I think Arminius was 13 and Calvin might have been 12. Yeah.
I think that's.
Yeah. But so Aquinas, working before these guys, Aquinas seemed to fit into this space of definitely a libertarian, right? He believed that humans were the causes, that they were the uncaused causes of their own actions. And so the Catholics definitely believe that, but Aquinas did this really weird sort of like end around that I'd be interested to actually study how much of an effect it had on compatibilism, because for Aquinas, there is nothing that happens, including your own actions, that is still not a part of God's own will. Like, you are free to do it. You're still 100% totally free in the uncaused cause of you doing it, but God is still somehow in control of it. It gets
He said there's no ungraced nature.
Yes. And grace is
So
the essence.
it's prevenient grace in Wesley. You know, there's always the grace that comes before. So yeah, I mean, that's one of the comments I would make, is that, you know, we don't, if we're understanding it as free will and free agency as Christians, we want to be careful not to, or if you're looking at the libertine, what is it?
Libertarian, yeah.
Libertarian category. You want to be careful not to move as a Christian to the point of believing that there is some place of freedom outside of God, because that we don't believe.
Right. And that was where Aquinas ultimately landed, right? Is that all freedom is still contained within within what we call God.
Yeah, we're creatures.
Are they still in Armenia?
The Catholics, strictly understood Catholic doctrine would still be very libertarian. Yeah. They wouldn't call themselves Arminian because Arminius, again, was a Protestant, and they don't want anything to do with Protestants generally. But because Aquinas did so much work on this already, Catholics love Aquinas. If you ever do any sort of Catholic theology, they will immediately point you to.
Well, St. Thomas Aquinas.
Right. Yes, he was a saint. But he developed most of what modern Catholic theology has sprung from. He was their major touch point, and anybody who's doing, again, any kind of Catholic theology will start from Thomas Aquinas.
I interrupted him. Sorry.
Bob, did you have anything else to add?
Yeah, and I mean, you know, when it gets down to talking about the person as the uncaused cause, I also am thinking, again, if we're looking at it from a Christian perspective, we understand personhood in a particular way. The person that we're talking about, that's if we want to call them an uncaused cause, I have a hesitation on that, because we believe a person is created. You know, they are a person because God has given them life. You know,
Right.
And
yeah.
so
Go ahead.
Well, and it's a particular God we believe in, that he's triune. So that
Yes.
personhood is not just understood individually. We individually are members of one another. You know, all of this is Christian understanding of personhood. I think has to be considered in this.
Yes, and I would agree. I think the place where I would try and parse out the terms a little bit is when we're talking uncaused cause in the strict sense of the freedom of our own actions, we're meaning something different than we are the ontological question of do we exist as uncaused things? And so it's a slightly nuanced discussion of saying, as Christians, we believe that there's only one uncaused first cause, if you will, and this is something that you hear in people like Aquinas, who would say that there's only one uncaused cause of everything, and that was God. But when you talk about it in terms of just your own actions, it's more like a helpful way to think about it, that there is not anything external of you and there's not anything internal of you that is causing your mental state or your action to come into being, except for you as the person. Maybe is the better way to think about it. And so it's a very slight definitional change, which is what philosophy is all about. It's a very slight definitional change from uncaused to like the only cause of your actions. And then again, you put that inside of the larger framework of, you know, God's grace and of God's own creation of other things. And that gets, it starts getting into very deep waters very quickly. Yeah. If you're interested in it, I could find Thomas Aquinas' major work that he did, the Summa Theologica. He has a whole section on this where he talks about the freedom of the will and how the freedom of the will, we're still libertarians, but we also still somehow work in accordance with God's plan. There's another really good author who wrote, I want to say he was writing in the 1600s as well. His name was Luis de Molina. That's an A. His name was Molina, and Molina came up with what is commonly known as the middle knowledge view. Because Molina was wrestling with the question of if humans are truly free, if humans can actually do, you know, humans have control over their own actions, if we actually do what we want to do, then how can God possibly know what we are going to do if God doesn't cause it to happen? And so Molina came up with this view that he called middle knowledge, which he said, okay, if we understand God's omniscience as God knows everything that's happening in the past, God knows everything that's going to happen in the present, God knows, or in the future, and God knows everything that's happening as present. Molina said there's also one other piece of knowledge that God's omniscience allows him to have, and he called it middle knowledge. And middle knowledge is, according to Molina, it's this understanding that God has knowledge of all counterfactuals, basically saying if something else were the case, then this would happen. So the example that I always like to give is under Molina's view that God knows that if I were put in Pontius Pilate's position, that I would have chosen to not crucify Jesus Christ. And so God has knowledge of that counterfactual. But because in God's plan, Jesus Christ had to be crucified so he could be buried and then be resurrected, Pilate was the person that was put in that place. And so under Molina's view, people still have free actions, people still have their choices, but God is aware of what all people will do in any and all circumstances. And so God is able to providentially order the world in such a way where people will freely accomplish God's purposes. That's Molina's view on middle knowledge. It's called Molinism. If you haven't heard of it, it's a really interesting view to go and look at. I hold to Molinism as a libertarian because it makes the most sense to me of how God is able to be providential and sovereign, but we are also able to be completely and totally free creatures. So I encourage you to go look at that if you haven't heard of it. But it helps make sense of some of those things like, again, you know, can God know the future and we still be free? Or what is it? Predestination and election, God's foreknowledge, even the existence and origin of evil, I think you can wrap up inside of Molinism. Not super tightly, but it has something really good to say to it, I think, which is important. Awesome. Are there any other thoughts, comments, questions, concerns? I know that was a ton of information that I just sort of dumped on you, but I think this is a really important discussion for us to have, especially as Wesley Arminians. Nazarenes are very, very staunchly Wesleyan. And so free will is something that's really good and important for us to hold on to. And I hope that diving into compatibilism and libertarianism a little bit allowed you to think a little bit more clearly about free will and about how we're impacted by by the way that we think about these different things. But we do have Christian brothers and sisters who very staunchly Calvinist and who would say that God predestines us, but that we are free because compatibilism is the events leading up to that, and it's the events running through a person. So if you disagree with them, you'd be able to have an intelligent and insightful conversation about why you don't think that's the case. Just something to ponder. I asked for questions and then I kept talking. So if we have questions or comments, I do that every week. Okay. Well, if there are no questions or comments, we can go ahead and wrap up for this evening. Next week's going to be a super fun week. It's really our only foray into the philosophy of science, but we're going to talk about the philosophy of space and time. We're going to ask ourselves, how do space and time interact with the Christian worldview? And then the week after that, we're going to talk ethics and morality. And we're going to ask the question, why should I be moral? Is there something that's right for me to do? Is there something that's wrong for me to do? Can I exercise my free will and choose the right thing? Or is there no right thing for me to choose? So we're going to ask that question in a couple of weeks. But next week is time and space. Next week is one of my favorite weeks to talk about because it gets crazy. We're going to talk about things and stuff. It'll be fun. Yeah, if nobody has anything else, thanks a ton again for being here, and we'll see y'all next week.
Good night.